In this video, we'll talk about human respiratory system. As you all know, we need energy to do each and every work or any activity. From where we will get this energy? Yes, we get this energy in the form of ATP that are produced in each and every cells of our body as a result of breakdown of nutrients like glucose. So in each and every cells of our body, there is a breakdown or oxidation of the nutrients like glucose to produce ATP. Later, this ATP is used as a source of energy to do any activity or the work in our body. But for the production of ATP, as a result of breakdown of nutrients like glucose, it need to be supplied with the oxygen, because for the oxidation of glucose, it requires oxygen. So each and every cells of our body need to be supplied with the oxygen. And during the production of ATP, or during this process, carbon dioxide is produced as a byproduct. So carbon dioxide is produced as a waste which need to be thrown out of the body. So each and every cells of our body need to be supplied with the oxygen, and whatever the carbon dioxide that are produced in the cell during the process need to be thrown out of the body. This exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the body, or each and every cells of the body, is nothing but the respiration, which is commonly called as breathing. So respiration means it's the exchange of oxygen and the carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the body, or each and every cells of our body, is nothing but the respiration. And whatever the gas that are involved in the process of respiration, that is carbon dioxide and oxygen, is known as respiratory gas. And whatever the part or the system that are involved for the respiration process is known as respiratory system. If we talk about the human respiratory system, we have well developed respiratory system, which is mainly composed of two components, that is upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. Upper respiratory tract mainly consisting of nostril, nasal cavity, pharynx and the larynx part, whereas lower respiratory tract consisting of trachea, bronchi, their branches and alveoli. So these are the different parts of the respiratory system which are mainly comes under upper and the lower respiratory tract. We'll discuss in detail these parts of the respiratory system. First, we'll talk about the upper respiratory tract, from which the respiratory system begins. So, human respiratory system begins with the first part, that is nostril. Nostrils, or the external nares, is nothing but the opening of the nose. So, whatever the opening that we have above the upper lip is nothing but the nostrils or the external nares. So this nostril or the external nares leads to nasal cavity. So nasal cavity is nothing but the space of the nose. So we have nasal cavity, or the space inside the nose, which is divided into left and right chamber or the cavity by a septum known as nasal septum. So nasal septum divides the nasal cavity or the nasal chamber into left and the right cavity. So external nares or the nostril leads to nasal cavity. Nasal cavity leads to pharynx. So this region is nothing but the pharynx. You know that pharynx is a funnel shaped structure which is a common passageway for both food and the air. And this pharynx is divided into mainly three parts, that is nasopharynx, oropharynx and laryngopharynx. So first part is nasopharynx, into which nasal cavity opens. So as the name indicate, nasal cavity opens into the first part of the pharynx known as nasopharynx. That's why it is known as nasopharynx, because nasal cavity opens there. Next is middle part, that is oropharynx, into which oral cavity opens. So oral cavity opens into the middle part of the pharynx known as oropharynx. The inner part or the posterior part of the pharynx is known as laryngopharynx, because this laryngopharynx opens into larynx and esophagus. So in the previous video we have already discussed about the esophagus or the food pipe, which is a part of the digestive system. If we talk about the respiratory system, this pharynx, that is laryngopharynx, leads to the larynx part, that is the next part of the respiratory system. So that's why it is known as laryngopharynx. So three parts of the pharynx is nasopharynx, oropharynx and laryngopharynx. So laryngopharynx leads to two opening, that is larynx and esophagus. So since we are discussing about the respiratory tract, we'll discuss only about the larynx. So pharynx leads to next part, that is larynx. Larynx, as you can see here, it is a cartilaginous box. So this cartilaginous box is nothing but the larynx, which helps in the sound production. That's why it is also known as a sound box. This larynx have a projection in the front of the neck, and it can be visualized from the front of the neck, and it is known as Adam's apple. So whatever the front projection of the larynx which can be visualized from the front of the neck is known as Adam's apple, which will be very prominent in the men. The opening of the larynx is known as glottis. So pharynx opens into the larynx through opening known as glottis. And this glottis also have a flap-like cartilaginous structure known as epiglottis. This epiglottis is very important because during swallowing of the food, this epiglottis closes the glottis. Thereby, it prevents the entry of food into the trachea. So, food need to go through only esophagus or the food pipe. It should not enter trachea, isn't it? And that is done with the help of this epiglottis. So, epiglottis is a flap-like structure which is present in the glottis, which is the opening of the larynx. And this epiglottis closes the glottis during the swallowing of the food, so that it prevents the entry of food into the larynx or the trachea. So that is about the larynx part. Larynx leads to next part, that is trachea, which is a part of lower respiratory tracts. So till now we discussed about the part of the upper respiratory tract, that is nostrils, which is opening, which leads to nasal cavity. Nasal cavity leads to the pharynx. Pharynx leads to larynx, which are the part of the upper respiratory tract. So the last part of the upper respiratory tract, that is larynx, leads to the first part of the lower respiratory tract, that is trachea. As you can see, this is a trachea which extends from the larynx down the neck up to the mid-thoracic cavity, and it is present just above the esophagus. So esophagus present behind and trachea is present above. At the level of fifth thoracic vertebrae, this trachea is divided into primary bronchi, that is right primary bronchus and left primary bronchus. And this right and the left primary bronchi leads or enters a respective part of the lung, that is right primary bronchus enters a right part of the lung and left primary bronchus enters a left part of the lung. The primary bronchi, upon entering into the respective part of the lung, it further divides. As you can see in this diagram, this primary bronchi further divides into secondary bronchus. So, the right primary bronchus divides into three secondary bronchus, whereas left primary bronchus divided into two secondary bronchus. So, right primary bronchus gives rise to three secondary bronchus and left primary bronchus gives rise to two secondary bronchus. So, primary bronchus further divide to form a secondary bronchi. Later, this secondary bronchi further divides to form a tertiary bronchi. As you can see, these are the right primary bronchus and this is the left primary bronchus, which divides into secondary bronchi. Secondary bronchi further divides into tertiary bronchi. This tertiary bronchi again further divides to form a bronchioles. So, primary bronchi gives rise to secondary bronchi, secondary bronchi gives rise to tertiary bronchus, tertiary bronchi divides to form a bronchiole. This bronchiole again further divides to form a terminal bronchioles. So, branches of bronchioles is known as terminal bronchioles. Trachea, right and left primary bronchus, secondary bronchus, tertiary bronchus, and initial part of the bronchioles are covered by a C-shaped or incomplete cartilaginous ring. As you can see, these are the C-shaped incomplete cartilaginous ring. So which part? That is trachea, primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and initial part of the bronchioles are covered by this C-shaped incomplete cartilaginous ring. And this C-shaped ring is complete in the front side and it is incomplete at the back side or behind part of the trachea. And this ring is present in C-shape just to avoid the collapse between the trachea and the esophagus, because behind the trachea esophagus is present, and esophagus is nothing but the food pipe through which a bolus or the ball of food travel. So during swallowing, the food travel through the esophagus, so during which this esophagus may collapse with the trachea. So to avoid the collapse of the trachea with the esophagus, the cartilaginous ring is incomplete at the behind or below the trachea, or behind part of the trachea the C-shaped ring is absent. So C-shaped ring is complete only in the front part of the trachea to avoid the collapse of trachea with the esophagus which is present behind the trachea. So primary, secondary, tertiary and the trachea and the initial part of the bronchioles are covered by an incomplete or C-shaped cartilaginous ring. Later, this bronchioles further divides to form a terminal bronchioles. So each this terminal bronchiole gives rise to many number of very thin, irregularly walled, highly vascularized bag-like structure known as alveoli. As you can see, each terminal bronchiole gives rise to this alveoli. In humans, each lung have about 300 millions of this alveoli, and it is this alveoli which is a structural and functional unit of the respiratory system. So part of the respiratory system from the nostril up to the terminal bronchiole is known as conducting part or the conducting zone of the respiratory system. As the name indicates, this conducting zone will conduct or it will transport the atmospheric air into the alveoli, during which it clears the air from the foreign particle, it humidifies the air and it brings the air to the body temperature. But there is no exchange of the gases in the conducting zone of the respiratory system. Then where there is a diffusion or exchange of the gas takes place? Yes, it is in the respiratory zone or exchange part of the respiratory system, which is nothing but the alveoli and its duct. Yes, the conducting zone or conducting part or the respiratory part of the respiratory system is nothing but the alveoli part, where there is an exchange of gas, that is exchange of oxygen and the carbon dioxide takes place between the blood and the atmosphere, or there is a diffusion of carbon dioxide and the oxygen between the blood and the atmospheric air takes place only in the alveoli part and its duct part, which is known as respiratory zone or respiratory part or exchange part of the respiratory system. So that is how trachea divides into bronchi, bronchioles, finally into alveoli that makes up the lung. And this lung is present in the thoracic cavity, which is an anatomically airtight chamber. This thoracic cavity, dorsally it is provided by a vertebral column, ventrally it is provided with the sternum, laterally it is provided with the ribs, and from the lower side it is provided by a dome-shaped diaphragm. So this anatomical setup of the thoracic cavity is very essential or crucial for the breathing process, so that if there is any change in the volume of the thoracic cavity, it will be reflected in the lung cavity, which is very important or essential for the breathing process. Anyhow, we'll discuss about the process of breathing in the next video. I hope this video is useful. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.